Okay, hopefully you can see that title screen there. So Trees Forever and partners are excited to be creating a buzz and providing this training on pollinators, soil and water, and perennials for pollinator habitat. We got quite a bit to cover today, so let's get to it. A little bit of a delay there. So first, a little background about Trees Forever, and then a review of exactly what we're talking about when we reference pollinators. Next, why are pollinators even important? Then we'll get into the heart of what pollinators need to survive and thrive and suggestions for attracting pollinators on your farm. So let me tell you a little bit about the great organization that I work for, Trees Forever. Our mission is to plant and care for trees and the environment by empowering people, building community, and promoting stewardship. Oh, a little bit of a delay, it looks like. There we go. Trees Forever was founded in 1989, and since then has planted more than 3 million trees. And we do this with a staff of roughly 22 individuals working in Iowa and Illinois. And we have participated in national projects and are supported basically by individuals like you. Through our Working Watersheds, Buffers and Beyond program in Iowa and the Illinois Buffer Partnership in Illinois, we are proud of the work and the projects that we've completed. And you can see just a sprinkling of those overall numbers since our inception, over 601 project and demonstration sites, over 76,000 volunteer hours logged. This is a great time to point out that Trees Forever really is a volunteer-based organization. The simple act of planting a tree can have profound impact far beyond that planting interaction as you watch that tree grow and mature. So very much volunteer oriented. A special thanks to our partners that help make this particular Creating a Buzz training possible. So what are pollinators? Well, first, we need to set the stage for what we mean when we talk about pollinators, because it's crucial to understand that while we talk about pollinators in a general term, pollinators include many, many things. So most of us are familiar with bees and butterflies, but it also includes more mundane insects like flies and beetles and moths. And let's not forget about mammals like bats and bears, and yes, even humans like you and me. And even within the insects, there's thousands of species that comprise pollinators, and they all have varying life cycles. So we just really need to keep that in mind as we continue on and think about pollinators and providing benefits and habitat for pollinators. Since we're talking about pollinators, I think it's worth remembering just what the act of pollination entails. So we're talking about transferring pollen from the male part of a plant, the anthers, to the female part of a plant, the stigma, which of course results in the production of seeds and fruits. So why are pollinators important, and why the concern over population declines the last decade or so? Well, the short answer is that pollinators are crucial to a healthy ecosystem and food supply. Pollinators are sometimes thought of as this canary in the coal mine and are a key indicator of ecosystem health. The reason is simple. 90% of wild plants need cross-pollination to survive and reproduce. And so when we put pollinators into the context of the overall food system, it's estimated that pollinators are responsible for roughly every third bite of food that we eat. Oh, another little delay. So a few facts and figures regarding pollinators and the food supply. So 84% of commercially grown crops are insect pollinated. Pollinators are going to affect roughly a third of global ag land. Native pollinators are going to provide important pollination services for some pretty key crops. You can see there alfalfa, cranberries, blueberries, sunflowers, and more. And the vast majority of pollinators are going to be these wild types. So that's the other thing to keep in mind is we all know about honeybees and of course the pollination services that honeybees provide to a lot of specialty crops, but the vast majority are going to be these wild types. So a few facts and figures regarding pollinators and their value to society. So between 235 and 577 billion worth of annual food production relies on the direct contribution of pollinators. US wild pollination worth roughly 10 billion annually. And then as I mentioned previously, honeybee pollination in and of itself is almost a $20 billion per year industry. And these are some dated figures too, going back to 2012. So they may have fluctuated since then. So we know pollinators are important. We've established that. But why are pollinators in danger? Well, many factors are going to contribute to declining numbers of pollinators in general, but we know that these numbers are declining. So for instance, among North American native bee species, again with sufficient data, more than half are declining. Nearly 1 in 4 native bee species is imperiled and at increasing risk of extinction. I absolutely love this photo because, again, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And so insects and other pollinators do this work for free as part of their routine every single day. And if they're not around to do this, someone else is going to need to fulfill that role of pollination. And so here is a fellow that's climbed up into the top of that tree and is doing some hand pollination on either some apples or plum trees or something like that. So I just think this really drives home the point when we talk about how important pollination services are, and someone's got to do it. So I like this. This is a graph that shows the total area in hectares occupied by the colonies of monarchs that overwinter in Mexico. And so it's more or less used as kind of a surrogate to gauge the overall health of the monarch population. And you can see an overall decline of over 80% on this 20-year average. However, a wide range of groups are working in Iowa to support monarch butterfly populations. You can see a few of them there, the Iowa Monarch Conservation Consortium, the different watchway stations, monarch zones, and certainly NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, has done a lot of work with helping to fund and promote habitat for pollinators of all types. And I guess I'm happy to announce that the work that some of those groups are doing is starting to pay off. So during the overwintering period of 2018 and 19, so not the most recent, but 18, 19, there was this 144% increase in that area occupied by the monarchs. And this is the largest increase that we've seen in over a decade. And so a lot of that is being attributed to some of the conservation efforts across the country, not only in Iowa, but certainly we're doing our part here as well. So why exactly are we seeing these declines in pollinator numbers? Again, many factors are going to play into the population declines that we've seen with pollinators of all types. So certainly, loss of habitat and seasonal forage is a concern. We know this. Exposure to pesticides and other chemicals is a concern. Invasive pests and diseases, they are certainly a problem. And finally, a changing climate means changing landscapes. And some of these pollinators have very intimate relationships with specific plants that they've more or less co-evolved with over very long periods of time. So what can we do about it? Well, if we're to protect pollinators, we must know what they need and how to protect them. And basically, pollinators need three main things. They need access to forage for the entire growing season. They need access to nesting sites. And then finally, they need protection from pesticide drift and disturbed habitat. Both of those are absolutely crucial for providing high quality habitat. So let's start with year-long forage. So you remember how I mentioned that we talk about pollinators as kind of a group and in general terms? But pollinators comprise thousands of different species of insects, mammals, birds, etc. Therefore, since we're trying to provide resources for all of these different types of pollinators, diversity is absolutely crucial. So like in real estate, where the mantra is location, 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 the mantra with pollinators is diversity, diversity, diversity. A good rule of thumb that we like to suggest is including at least 3 species that bloom early, at least 3 species that bloom during the middle of the growing season, and then finally 3 species that are going to bloom later in the fall. Now, the reason for this is because some of these pollinator species will live their entire life cycle in the early part of the year. Some of these species won't even emerge to start their life cycle until the middle or later parts of the year. So providing all of this diversity is going to ensure that there's going to be some sort of habitat for all species throughout the growing season. You know, another good suggestion is to maybe make the native seed mix a little heavy on the forbs and the flowers. Over time, grasses can tend to take over. So if we boost that initial level of forbs and flowers in our seeding mix, we can kind of help to overcome that. And then finally, include a wide range of colors and heights. That's all a component of diversity as well. I like this little matrix here. It kind of presents a wealth of information on the types of pollinators you can see on the top there, and then some of the needs that they have, and then some of the diversity that can be provided. And this is something that can be found at pollinator.org. You know, sometimes we miss the forest for the trees, as it were. And so pollinator habitat is much more than just prairie. So perennials of all types can provide valuable habitat for forage or nesting, and especially in the early part of the season. So next, I want to highlight a few of the trees and shrubs that are particularly valuable when it comes to providing pollinator habitat. So oaks are the quintessential wildlife plant for mammals and birds, a vast array of insects. Oaks provide plenty of bird food, as it were. And so experts believe that oak forests support the most diverse flower populations outside of the jungle rainforests of the tropics. Now, many of these species have evolved to live in the shade of oak trees. Again, that coevolution that I talked about earlier. When we look specifically at oak trees and their leaves, they provide food for more than 500 species of butterflies and moths. So oaks are kind of a powerhouse when it comes to providing some of the pollinator habitat. Willows. So willows are very large and they're a diverse group of trees. There's more than 100 different species that grow in the United States and Canada. There's 6 different species that reach kind of tree size in Iowa. They're the Missouri, the pussy, the sandbar, the shining, the peach leaf, and black willows. And black willow is by far the largest of all the tree willows in Iowa. It can get 30 to 60 feet in a diameter of 14 to 24 inches. It is native to all of Iowa, except away in the far northwest corner, probably up there in Lyon and Sioux counties. And again, willows are going to support many of the showiest butterflies and moths that we have, including the comas, the viceroys, the red-spotted purples, mourning cloaks, and sphinx moths. And willows are really an excellent host for some of the wood-boring beetles, and therefore they attract some of the woodpeckers that'll eat the larvae basically all winter long. So willows are kind of a powerhouse when it comes to providing some of that early season, especially pollinator habitat. Wild plums are a great pollinator resource, especially for the caterpillars that like to munch on their leaves. And in addition, they produce a nice fruit for humans and other wildlife habitat. So wild plums certainly are going to be a nice option to include as far as trees and shrubs go. Elderberry. So elderberry is a great agroforestry crop, producing these delicate flowers, and then of course the antioxidant-rich berries. The father of medicine, Hippocrates, called elderberry the medicine chest of all plants for its remarkable properties. It's been used as a supplement to fight flu and cold. It's a very useful plant to humans and pollinators alike. In addition to a forage resource, the hollow stems of the elderberry can assist with nesting for those boar nesting types of pollinators. And elderberry can still be found in a lot of undisturbed areas like fence lines and road ditches. It's highly recognizable with the beautiful white flowers, typically in early July, and really delicate flowers that'll eventually give way to the fruit that you can kind of see there that hangs on the drupes. So elderberry is a great agroforestry crop and a great crop for pollinators. You know, grasses like side oats grama provide valuable nesting habitat for ground nesting pollinators that require this undisturbed area for the labyrinth of tunnels and chambers that they use to lay their eggs and then store provisions. I love this next one here, prairie dropsy. This is one of my favorites. It really looks nice as a bunch grass, kind of growing in these attractive clumps. But in the summertime, when you cut it, it smells like buttered popcorn. So it really has that unique characteristic to it as well. Oh, wow. The pictures. I love this presentation for all the great pictures. And this one just, bam, Liatris, blazing star. This is a stunning prairie flower. It blooms toward the end of summer and early autumn, just starting to pop now. I was at Lime Creek Nature Center last night for a prairie walk, and it's just starting to emerge. It's going to provide some excellent forage during a crucial time of the year right now through the end of the growing season. So Liatris is another one of those fantastic plants for pollinators. Hepatica. Now, this is an early spring bloomer and traditionally kind of thought of as this true indicator of the emergence of spring. It's got this unique flower that grows on individual stems, and then they're covered by these kind of long, fine hairs. And it is a woodland species, so it can handle shade, and so it can be a nice species for areas in the garden or farm that are prone to shading. So the next critical item for pollinators is access to nesting sites. And this is a really important one in addition to providing those forage resources that we have. And so when we talk about nesting, pollinators can either be cavity nesters or they're going to be these ground nesters. And so cavity nesters, as the name implies, they're going to use these naturally occurring crevices or boreholes that are created by others to lay their young in the different types of chambers. And then you get to the ground nesters, and they're going to use this system of tunnels and chambers to house their eggs and the larvae, of course. And so, interestingly enough, when we think of all of our native bee species, over 4,000 of them, roughly 70% are going to nest in the ground, and they're not going to travel very far. They stick pretty close to their nest as well. So some interesting tidbits there. So this is an interesting one. Undisturbed areas are absolutely vital for pollinator habitat. So dead trees, brush piles, tall grasses, and ground litter are going to provide crucial homes for all of these little pollinators. So an example, the queen rusty patch bumblebee. This is a threatened species in the state of Iowa. It spends its winters hunkered down in only about 3 centimeters of dirt under the duff layer of the woods. And so this insulates it enough to stay toasty warm during the harsh winter until it can emerge in the spring. And so it's one of these species that not only needs some of the pollinator and forb resources that can be found in prairies, but it also needs a good woodland component as well to complete its life cycle. So that's another one to or an example, I should say, of undisturbed areas that we need for some of these different needs for pollinators. So finally, we need to be thinking about some common sense things to protect pollinators and other insects from drift. If I were in person, I'd ask for a raise of hands on who integrates or who uses IPM, integrated pest management. But promoting good stewardship for pollinators is really the name of the game, and we can do this in several different ways. I want to take a little bit more in-depth look at each one of these. And so we're going to start with integrated pest management. So this is an adult pyrite bug feeding on white fly nymphs. And so IPM refers to integrated pest management. I'd like to assume that a lot of you are aware of the basic tenets of IPM, but as my physics teacher told me, when you assume, you make an ass of you and me. So very quickly, step one is going to be, we're going to limit the conditions that allow pests to thrive. So insects really know which plants are the weakest, and they kind of start there. So proper plant and soil nutrition is really going to help keep insects at bay. Next, it's important to establish an economic threshold for when you should take action. This is a formal step that's kind of overlooked sometimes. So we know that bugs and critters are going to get something in our fields, but at what point do we need to step in with some sort of a management technique to control any outbreaks that can do damage beyond that economic threshold? So there is an old saying in engineering that you can't manage what you don't measure. Meaning, if we're going to try to manage a system or a component of the system, we need to be monitoring and measuring to determine where things stand compared to the baseline. And so that's what monitoring and scouting pest populations is all about. And then once you've done the previous 3 steps, the final step is really straightforward. Take the action needed to control whatever pests are a problem. And this can be done in many, many ways and may include some sort of spray or pesticide application. So when it comes to that pesticide, and I know this may sound like preaching to the choir, but you all know this is true and it bears repeating, the label is the law. Read it and abide by it. For example, often to avoid exposing insect pollinators to pesticides, timing of the application is carefully spelled out on the label relative to the blooming stage of the crop and other plants. Similarly, follow the pesticide label requirements regarding application conditions, such as wind speed, wind direction, temperature, relative humidity. All of these things are going to factor in if we're going to be doing some sort of a spray application. Finally, some common sense steps can really go a long way to minimizing drift and undue exposure. So just think through things and take the necessary steps once you've thought of a potential issue or a potential choke point in the process. So a few tips to minimize offsite drift. It's important to establish appropriate buffers or no spray zones between treated areas and pollinator habitat. Again, pay attention to the weather, wind speed, direction, temperature, relative humidity. This is an important one. Calibrate the sprayer very often, checking those individual nozzle outputs and patterns to ensure that the right rate's being applied. To the extent that you can, choose low pressure or low drift nozzles to minimize any of that drift. And then really, we should never be spraying near ponds, irrigation dishes, other sources of open water, essentially. You know, of all the tips and suggestions for protecting pollinators, this one is probably at the top of the list. So it's important that we're communicating and cooperating so that we can all work together to protect pollinators. So for the farmer or the landowner, discuss your pest management plans involving pesticides with any beekeepers, where hives might be placed, or where there's any specialty crop producers. Discuss any bee issues with your renter or landowner, if that's applicable. Determine who might be the person that reaches out to contact beekeepers or specialty crop producers that might have land adjacent to yours. It's nice to notify, letting everyone know, whether that's a beekeeper or specialty crop producer, when you're going to be doing some sort of a pesticide application. try to, to the extent possible, help bees and other insect pollinators by providing some of that forage in maybe non-crop areas, in maybe vegetative buffer strips, or even in road ditches. So maybe we just don't cut the road ditch for forage and allow that to be a repository for a bee species. You know, for the pesticide applicators, it's important that you work with your customers to identify those beekeepers and specialty crop producers in the area where those pesticides are going to be applied. Certainly, you need to know all of the state laws and abide by them as you're doing the applications. So a great communication tool that everyone should know about is called FieldWatch. And this was really set up to be a clearinghouse for specialty crop producers, beekeepers, row crop farmers, and applicators, so that information can be shared across industries and operations to protect pollinators and pollinator habitat. And the way that it works is, if you're a beekeeper or a specialty crop producer, you can go into this free website, you can register for free, you can outline the areas where you have hives or specialty crops that are being produced. It shows up on a big map, and then this map is interactive and it can be accessed by co-ops, by private pesticide applicators, by farmers, by anybody that needs to know that in this particular location there are susceptible beehives, there's susceptible specialty crops, and so you need to pay attention and really know that information before you go out and do some sort of an application. So FieldWatch, it's free. I can't suggest it enough. It's something that everyone that is a beekeeper or a specialty crop producer should get registered on. And then, of course, those row crop producers and applicators should be checking it often to see who in their neighborhood has potentially susceptible areas. So finally, just a couple of slides to really reinforce this need for undisturbed habitat for pollinators. Now, we've talked about how important it is for nesting, but at the same time, we need to be actively managing our pollinator habitat, and that can involve disturbing the area through things like mowing or grazing or burning. And so a general rule of thumb when it comes to managing pollinator habitat, whether it's prairie or woodlands, is to use the rule of thirds, to break up the management of an area into thirds so that the entire area isn't disturbed and some sort of refuge is going to exist for pollinators to escape to if we're doing some mowing or some burning. Of course, spot spraying is going to be more desirable than simply broadcast spraying when it comes to some trouble areas on the farm where we may need to address some thistles or other targeted weed problems or invasives. So certainly, again, just a couple of tips to think about when we, oh, I love this. So this is one of my favorite photos, and they do say a picture is worth 1,000 words. So keep in mind that these standing perennials can provide habitat that pollinators need. So here is a little leafcutter bee larvae, warm and toasty inside the stem, waiting for the days to get longer and for spring to arrive. And so in this particular case, just by not mowing, we're providing some of that nesting habitat for this particular species here. So, oh, I love this one. Again, the photos are fantastic in the presentation here. So what can you do on your farm to attract pollinators? Well, in my mind, it all begins with understanding right plant, right place. So know your piece of ground. Is it high and dry? Is it low and moist? This is going to influence the species composition that will thrive in that particular area. What is the underlying soil type? Is the site in full sun or partial shade? These are other important questions to ask as you begin planning your planting. And planning is always a crucial component that is often overlooked. So take the necessary time to monitor, to get to know your site. Again, high and dry. Does it have moisture on it? Does it not drain very well? Once you've kind of got a feel for the site that you're going to be planting into, next, to the extent that you can, strive for these local ecotype seed and plant a range of diverse plant sizes, from the large cup plant, for instance, and compass plant, to a rattlesnake master, lead plant, and others. Having a good mature size difference is part of the diversity that I mentioned earlier. So in establishing new pollinator habitat, it takes time. It really does. It takes time to plan out the planting, to get started with proper site selection, and then moving into that site prep for planting. And sometimes this can take a year or more. But once you have selected a good site and adequately prepared it and planted it, well, now maintenance kicks in. And so just a few words to pass along here is be patient. It takes time for these plantings to get where they need to be. There is a succession that needs to take place, and it often involves weeds and a not so good looking site in year one, but be patient. Keep it mowed high, about 8 inches, and certainly spot spray where needed to get on top of problem areas, thistles or other areas that might be encroaching on and choking out some of that stuff. But overall, be patient. I can't stress that enough. And I love the little sign that's in the photo here, prairie planting in progress. And so that lets folks know that there is an intentional planting here. It may not look the best now, but yes, indeed, we do have a planting that is supposed to be here, and it may not look good, but it's coming. It's coming. So the following are just a couple of suggestions, for adding pollinator habitat to your farm. So silvopasture. Really quickly, silvopasture is a managed system where we are managing not only the tree canopy so that we ensure enough light penetrates the tree canopy to grow the forage on the canopy floor, but we're also managing then our animals so that they don't overgraze those silvopasture areas. I want to stress it's managed. It is not just letting your cows or sheep or something out into the woodlot to graze. Nothing is going to kill your trees quicker than that. So silvopasture is a managed system. Very important. Certainly alley cropping. So this is a great opportunity to still grow your annual row crops in these wide alleys between rows of high value hardwoods or trees and shrubs that might be producing nuts or berries or whatever the case may be. So this is another opportunity to easily get some pollinator habitat in there. Riparian buffer. Again, riparian buffer is a system. It's not just trees planted down by the river or the stream. Riparian buffer consists of many different components, starting with a native forb and grass mix along the leading edge where your crops would be grown. And then that gives way to kind of that shrub layer, and then your slower growing trees, your faster growing trees, and your slower growing trees, and then maybe some of your stream-based stabilization species. But it's very much a component of the overall system native plants can play, thus providing some of that pollinator habitat. And of course, the riparian buffer has the added benefit of it's going to be able to provide some of that early season habitat because of the trees and shrubs that are growing there. You know, prairie strips and field borders are great opportunities to get pollinator habitat mixed into our annual row crop areas. Field borders, prairie strips, if you're not familiar with them, that's a concept that Iowa State's worked a lot with on no-till acres and relatively steep slopes, is going ahead and putting in some vegetative prairie strips that can provide a multitude of benefits, from reducing soil erosion and surface runoff to then providing that pollinator habitat as well. And then there's always these niche areas. Perhaps more and more folks are getting involved with irrigation, and so the corners of those center pivot irrigation areas can sometimes be great opportunities to get some pollinator habitat and a diverse mix into that area. So just be looking for those. There's always small areas that may not be conducive for row cropping for maybe some of the larger equipment that we have nowadays. Even on our farms and our acreages, we can find little areas that we can plant a really diverse mix of prairie flowers and grasses to provide a lot of that pollinator habitat. Backyards. Let's not overlook the importance that our backyards can provide, even in residential and urban settings, providing that habitat. Here you can see all the different butterfly milkweed and coneflower and black-eyed Susans, and looks like some cut plant in the back there. So even in smaller areas, we can still provide a lot of that diversity. And then once you get your neighbors involved, you can all plant something a little bit different, or have similar mixes, but then provide some of those corridors where those species can thrive. So, and don't forget that not only do these areas benefit and provide habitat and nesting resources for pollinators, but other beneficial insects as well that might be a predator for some of the pests that you find in the garden. So they can serve the same types of needs. So I want to thank certainly the folks that helped us provide funding for this. This particular slide is some funding opportunities that exist for cost share and technical assistance in planning for a pollinator planting. Many of them are in the pollinator toolkits that we have on our website. If you'll go to the Trees Forever website, Google Pollinator Plus Toolkit, we have this electronic, I guess we've collated a bunch of resources from vendors that can provide contract services as well as seeds and plugs. And that's really a document that the Tallgrass Prairie Center has put together that we link to. There's great resources from NRCS. There's fantastic resources on how to establish either from corn and soybeans or from a sod type of CRP, how to get more forbs and pollinator habitat. And so great resources in that toolkit. And again, these organizations can provide some cost share funding and technical assistance.